everybody. Welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey, and with me once again I have
Alex Carrick, chief economist of ConstructConnect. People know us more as Daily Commercial News, probably, in relation to your podcast. But anyway, that's what we are, ConstructConnect.
And I'm Michael Guckes, senior economist at ConstructConnect.
And since, well, I guess we're in the middle of February by now, but what we're looking to do is look at what's in store for us in the rest of the year, economically speaking, in terms of the industry and in terms of sort of greater headwinds and geopolitical and otherwise conditions. So I guess, Alec, take us away with what you think is the big looming stuff for this year.
Well, everybody's just kind of hanging fire, waiting for the recession. And I don't know, to some extent, I think it's kind of overblown. I mean, the U.S. numbers, the first two quarters of last year were weak. There's no question about that. But quarters 3 and 4 were quite strong. And U.S. GDP growth for the whole of 2022 was plus 2.1%, which is exactly the same as it's been on average for the last 20 years. So the U.S. economy has been doing pretty decent. And one of the indicators I always look at is initial jobless claims. And initial jobless claims are back under 200,000 because the figure, if you're above 300,000, you start to worry about a real slowdown and so on. But between 300 and 200,000, that indicates a labor market that's quite tight. And under 200,000, that's exceptional. I mean, that means almost everybody's got a job. So that's very good. And then inflation's, there are indications that inflation's coming down. Gasolines, it's not as if prices aren't still high, but the year-over-year change in prices has significantly moderated. Gasoline's sort of flat year-over-year. And the things that are still increasing are food, because food's around 10%. And the other thing that's increasing is the cost of mortgages and so on. But, that's not much of an argument for raising interest rates to fight inflation if raising interest rates is causing inflation. So it's kind of a circular argument. And then there's an indicator that the Federal Reserve looks at, which is the PCE, personal consumption expenditures, less food and energy. And I've heard they claim that is their chief indicator of what's happening with inflation. And it's only plus 4.4% year over year. So the federal funds rate is 4.5 to 4.75. And they're still talking about increasing it some more. And then other analysts are saying, but then at the second half of the year, they'll be bringing down interest rates. So I don't know. I don't know whether that makes any sense. I mean, what central banks like is they like a neutral level of interest rates so that they can go up and down and influence the economy that way. I suspect that interest rates are about as high as they're going to go, and maybe towards as we get further into the year, they'll come down. The big problem is residential, and it's single-family residential. In terms of construction, last year we had huge number of big, mega-sized, billion-dollar industrial and engineering projects. But what's affected now with the high interest rates is residential construction and some categories of commercial construction. So that's where the fault line lies for construction generally. I think there's still going to be some very big projects that start this year because they're designed for dealing with zero carbon emissions, the zero carbon emission goal over the long term. So I think that's kind of it from my viewpoint.
And Michael, what are your boogeymen or lack thereof?
Sure. Well, I'm just going to elaborate, maybe touch on a few things that Alec alluded to. but they are important. So things like real versus nominal data, right? And Alec spoke to this, but it's so incredibly important still. I think even as inflation is moderating, we need to continue as business leaders and industry subject matter experts, continue to watch inflation. It's rearing its head in somewhat different ways than it has the past 2 years. And, obviously all of us, all three of us at least, have been looking very carefully at material prices because they presented a cost risk exposure to a lot of construction firms, every construction firm. But that is changing. And we have seen over the last 12 months or so, this rapid slowing of material price inflation in the construction space. But what we're not seeing is a slowdown in wages. We're still seeing, especially within construction, we're seeing 5+% year-on-year increases in hourly wages for construction workers. So, I think the cost exposure, that the risk among your various costs as a construction firm, it's just changing a little bit, and you're going to have to shift your focus this year from really worrying about your materials to really worrying about, how are you going to pay for the labor that you must have to build your projects. And then I'll add one other point to that, which is I look at inventory to supply ratios at various levels, so at the wholesale level and at various levels. But, when we look at inventory to supplies, they're getting a little high. Cyclically, you should be right around 1.4 to 1.5 times, your inventory to sales. And there are ratios out there that you can get available through, the government of either Canada or the U.S. that tracks these things. But right now, when you look at those ratios, you're closer to 1.6, 1.7, even maybe 1.8, depending on the commodity that you're looking at. So what it tells me is that we have, for a lot of commodities, we're beginning to build up maybe as high of an inventory as we want in these things. And what that means is that if you're holding a lot of inventory now as a construction firm, offloading that, getting rid of that is going to become more difficult, especially at the price that you may have paid for it. So for example, say you have a lot of inventory and you're bidding on a project and you have a competitor and he's bidding on the same project and he has no inventory. So he has no current carrying cost, but you have a warehouse full of stuff. He may be able to go out onto the spot market right now and buy the materials he needs at a lower price than what you paid for all those materials, plus the carrying cost of that right now. So there's, in my mind, from an accounting perspective, I think the construction industry needs to be thinking about, how are you going to adjust your inventory mindset because you're going to become less and less competitive if these trends continue to take place. So that's, my big message here. The second thing that Alec mentioned was residential weakness. And I think he's absolutely right. We're seeing mortgage origination data, permit data, all point to a lot of weakness in this area. But within the non-residential side, which does include multifamily, we're seeing better strength in the multifamily side. We did see in December, and in the latest data, there were some lower figures than you would want to see on the multifamily side, but it's nothing like what we're seeing on the single family side. And I think Alec did a great job of pointing out that, there's a certain interest rate sensitivity to those single family homes, especially when we look at the median home price right now, both in Canada and the US. Those prices are very high. And with falling real incomes or plateaus, saying it maybe most optimistically with flat real incomes, the interest sensitivity is there, and because of that interest exposure, right? The single family market is struggling so substantially more than I think that multifamily side. So again, this leads to the greater point that is there are pockets of strong opportunity within the construction sector. You just have to look a little harder for them. I think is my biggest takeaway during, I would say, this podcast is, as an industry, we need to be working smarter, not just harder. And part of that working smarter is going to be keeping attuned to these dynamics that are affecting all of these many elements of the construction industry.
Speaking of elements that, well, may or may not affect the construction industry, the tech sector took a big hit for the first time in a long time. Nothing on the magnitude of the 90s, but big for, it's been pretty stable for a long time. And back in the 90s, construction had nothing to do with tech, basically. And now it's not super developed tech-wise, but there's a lot more intertwining than there used to be. How does that, if it does affect, how does that affect the construction industry?
Well, everything ties together. I mean, this is why I like economics. It's because there's nothing that doesn't have an impact. The story with tech, as much as anything, was that there was a huge surge in office building construction for a while before the pandemic, and it was almost all driven by tech companies in Canada. It happened in the United States earlier than that, but it was a lot of tech companies coming to Canada. People don't realize just how big Canada has become in terms of tech services, and how important a city like Toronto is, for example, in the North American scene in having tech workers. And before the pandemic, there was a huge surge in office building in Toronto driven by the tech companies. But of course, when the pandemic arrived, it was the tech companies who realized quicker than anybody else that they didn't have to work from the office. So a lot of the tech workers went home, and they've been working from their home. Now, some of that's going to revive, but if you're looking at the office building market, for example, it's hard to see where the demand is really going to come from. It's going to take a while for the cycle of office building construction to really pick up again. And then there's other aspects to tech. I mean, there's communications, the spending that's on communications and 5G networks and that sort of thing. And that is going to happen. And then tech influences so many other aspects. I mean, the one that's really obvious is the United States is making a real push to bring chip making capacity home. You see, the whole thing with the U.S. and I really kind of talk about the U.S. because those trends may spill over into Canada and should spill over into Canada, but we've got to see it actually happening. The U.S. Under the current administration, and this was pointed out in the State of the Union address, the U.S. with its IIJA and the IRA and the CHIP bill is a lot of that is designed to address zero carbon emissions going forward. So you get these huge projects in terms of battery plants and so on. But another aspect of it is that the U.S. is thinking strategically. Like in this new world that's going to have an awful lot more use of electricity and hydrogen maybe, and carbon capture and storage and that sort of thing. How do you want to be positioned in that world? And one of the ways is that you've got to bring home chip making capacity, because that has really, as the president pointed out, the U.S. invented chips, but then all of the development, and 70%, something like 70% of the chips that go into automobiles are made in China. So bring that chip making capacity home. And it's just unbelievable how many big chip making plants are proceeding in the United States. So that's the kind of impact that tech can really have on construction activity. And Canada, because since the audience is for the podcast, I don't know, Warren, maybe the audience for the podcast isn't Canada.
Some of it's not the U.S. If you look at the stats, which I have, we have a fair number of U.S. listeners as well.
Yeah, so Canada's got to get some of this work.
Yeah, Alec has a great point there that a lot of the policies that appear to be gaining ground in the U.S. are inward looking, and I don't necessarily think that that's ideal. I think that we are stronger together. When we think broadly about how we can work as a global economy, I think that's when we are at our strongest. And when we try to rely on, when any country simply tries to rely on its own inner strength and it doesn't take advantage of the competitive advantages of its neighboring countries and its economic partners, that is to the detriment of everybody. So I fully agree with out there. Warren, to your question about the tech sector, I just want to mention briefly that, I think a lot of the weakness that we're seeing in the tech sector as it relates to Wall Street, a lot of it has to do with the fact that historically the tech sector gets its earnings. Its earnings are projected always further out in the future, right? They're always coming up with the latest and greatest product, but it's not going to be commercialized at volume, right, until some number of years down the road. And so that string of future profits is always going to be highly sensitive to interest rates. And so to the degree that the Federal Reserve is signaling, hey, we're going to hold rates higher for longer, things like that, it really impacts that discounted cash flow of those tech companies that are expecting all of these, great future profits 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. And so I think that's the long and short to the sort of the core of the question you first asked.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me just throw in another statistic though, because this is fascinating, and I don't know to what extent people know this. There was a time versus all four major stock market indices, the DJI, Standard & Poor's, NASDAQ, and TSX. They had their last real trough period in February of 2009. Between then and end of 2 years ago and beginning of last year, NASDAQ had increased by 10 times. Like, it hadn't doubled, it hadn't gone up 3 times or 4 times. It was up by a factor of 10. And it was inevitable that there was going to be some kind of correction there. It's not like that's a huge surprise. The Toronto Stock Exchange in the same period of time had increased by 1.5 times, 1.5 to 2 times. So that's one of the differences between the U.S. and Canadian economies. I mean, the U.S. benefits tremendously from the fact it's got so many head offices of high-tech firms within its borders.
And we just briefly mentioned the State of the Union. So, and when you look at the setup for right now, there's definitely not going to be an election until 2024 in the States. There's probably not going to be one until 2025 in Canada. I can't see the Liberals calling one anytime soon. So given that we're going to have the same stable government in the same places, what do you see in terms of political moves? I know in terms of the U.S., they've got to deal now with the fact that they don't run Congress anymore. So things are a little different there than they used to be.
Yeah, so it's I did something last week. I did an event, and people asked me, what are the things to really watch for? And I've got to believe one of the real things to watch is the state of U.S. politics, because it's been, I mean, let's be honest, it's been somewhat chaotic for a number of years now. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But a lot of U.S. politics over the next couple of years is going to be dealing with social issues rather than economics. I think a lot of the legislation is in place. The legislation that applies to the economy is probably already in place, and it's a matter of letting those issues play out. It's probably going to have more to do with bringing in checks and balances on the police and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Michael, you're in the belly of the beast. What do you think?
When it comes to the politicians, one of the things I always find most interesting is that the parties, whoever's not in power wants to always save money. We're spending too much, and then as soon as that party is in power, they're trying to spend on all of these initiatives. And sometimes I look at that and think that maybe that's a little bit two-faced, obviously. There are plenty of good initiatives that I think both sides would agree are good initiatives, and yet they seem to talk less about where they agree. They seem to enjoy more talking about where they disagree, and I find that might be a disservice to all of us. So, I think at the end of the day, they'll get the job done. They just do it maybe kicking and screaming a little more than I wish they would, because a lot of that might be superfluous. But I'll leave it at that.
The other really big issue is whether there's the debt ceiling and whether the United States is in any danger of defaulting. But this is something that's talked about every time, and they find a way to resolve it. But so that's why you got to watch and pay attention to what's going on and hear how close to the brink they come. And nobody worries until it's the very last second, because it is always resolved in the past. But who knows? Who knows with what's going on now? That's why it's so riveting to turn on CNN and watch the latest gyrations.
Well, I mean, just in terms of Canada, Alex, do you see any problems coming our way, politically speaking? I guess there's the healthcare thing that is becoming a big deal, and that's a lot of money that's going to get thrown around.
Yeah, well, in Canada, it's all a question of whether we just go on with what we've got right now, or will there be a shift to the right because of the change in the leadership of the Conservative Party. And Canada's always got its interesting issues, because you got Quebec that's wants to go its own way on a whole bunch of things in terms of energy, for example. They don't want fracking in Quebec, and Alberta wants an awful lot more control over its energy resources, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, given that Alberta doesn't have any access to ports and so on, though it does have pipeline possibilities and already existing pipelines and pipeline possibilities. There's always those contentious issues in Canada. The only other thing that I would bring up is population change. And I always am talking about population change. And it's because it's just so incredible in Canada. And so this is politics too. I mean, the Liberals have let in a huge number of people. The immigration numbers are through the roof. A number 5 years ago or so, I used to think that Canada would reach a population of 40 million within 10 years, and would do projections and that sort of thing. Canada is likely to reach a population of 40 million next year. I mean, it's just there's been tremendous increases in population. The size of the Canadian population in the last year has increased by 900,000, and it used to be a good year when it was 500,000. Now it's not. It's 900,000 because of refugees and foreign students and so on. But 900,000 people per year. Canada has only 6 cities of 1 million people each. So you let in. You let in 900, you have an increase and not let in. A lot of it's immigration, though. Of the 900,000, certainly like 80-90% of it is immigration. But if you've got an increase in population of 900,000, then the projections about residential weakness, well, you got a problem. If you got a residential weakness, that's not going to fly, because you've got to accommodate all the people who are coming in. And if you've got 6 cities in the country of a 1 million people, only 1 million people, then just think about the infrastructure that's needed to add 1 million people, 900,000 people every year. It's enormous opportunities for construction. And then Toronto, I think I've said this before on your podcast, Warren, but I don't think most Canadians realize that Toronto's population is 93% of the population of Montreal plus Vancouver. So like Toronto's as big as the next 2 cities in the country. And Toronto is adding people faster than Montreal plus Vancouver. Toronto in the latest year added 140,000 people. Montreal added 40, and Vancouver added 80. So Montreal and Vancouver plus 120, and Toronto added 140,000 people in the latest year. One in 6 Canadians lives in Toronto. 1 in 3 Canadians lives in Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver. So look to your left, look to your right, and one of the 3 of you lives in one of those.
If you could look at me, I'm in Vancouver. Michael's the outlier here. He's in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Well, if I could have my pick, I would go to Toronto, possibly.
It's a nice place.
Yeah. Have you been to Vancouver, though, Michael?
Oh my gosh, it was 1997, and I was on a cruise boat, so I don't think that's fair. I don't think that was fair to the other cities that I got to see the best of Vancouver, but I've driven and through the others. Hey, can I follow up with just a few last comments, Warren?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I love what Alex said. The population discussion is an important one. I think there's a lot of policy, both in Canada and the US, that needs to be had around how we manage population. One of the things that I see, and I'm not saying that anyone else is agreeing with me, but when we look at population growth and really the lack thereof, I see it as a restraint or a constraint on the economic growth of both countries. The solo growth model or any growth model really says that an economy grows because of labor, capital, and technology. And those things are really the 3 most fundamental components to an economy. And what we have right now is, I think to some degree, you could say we have a shortage of population. If we were mixing these things like you're mixing concrete, right? And you've got water and you've got the cement mix, I think we're a little bit light on the population part of that mixture. And so immigration, as Alec pointed out, immigration is a short term, or it's not a short term, it is an immediate way to address this problem. And immigration has been successfully used in past periods, right, to great effect. But the fact that we're short on people, I think, is part of the reason why I put less weight behind unemployment rates right now. And that's all I'm going to say there. I'm just going to say that, we have a shortage of people out there. If we had more people, the economies of both Canada and the US would probably be able to grow faster. Secondly, the things that I'm looking at, and these are not strictly construction things, but I'm looking at commercial real estate loan standards, right? So there is a loan officer survey conducted by the Federal Reserve on a monthly basis, and it basically says, are your bank lending standards tightening or loosening? And they track this. And for commercial real estate, the numbers are not going in our favor. They are certainly tightening their standards around issuing loans in the CRE space. So I don't like that. The other things that I'm nervous about are the savings rate, right? And I'm speaking only of the US population at this moment, but savings rates are at essentially multi-decade lows. We're down below 4%, which is cyclically very low. And that means that we're exposed, right? If a family has a financial crisis, someone gets sick, something else happens, right? You are, a small bill away from possibly not being able to meet your financial obligations. And that does create a risk to the economy when enough people are in that situation. And then secondly, the corollary to this part is the loan and debts. So if we look at the number or the size of loans and debts that are 30 to 89 days past due right now in the US, that number is coming quickly back to historic levels. So essentially, I think what we're seeing, part of what we're seeing in that data is all of that stimulus money, and even some more of it, due to a strong jobs market, people are getting ahead of themselves again, to the point where their debt loads are quickly getting to a precarious state, and I don't like that either. I don't want to see the debts going from 0 to 30 days to 30 to 89 days, past due. That makes me nervous because so much of the economic and business cycle has to do with the flow of credit, right? Credit is simply bringing future purchasing forward. Well, on the backside of that, if you get ahead of yourself, now you have to find a way to pay off all that stuff, which means you can't make new purchases now. And that's just part of that business cycle. And so these are the things that I'm watching, and I would encourage others to watch. And you can get this data through the ConstructConnect website, the economic news that Alex and I post there. It's also available through the Federal Reserve website. So there's a lot of ways you can get a bunch of this data for free. And I just want your readership, your listenership to know that.
I can't think of a better way to wrap things up. So thanks very much, Michael, and thanks very much, Alex.
Very good. Good stuff.
Thank you, Warren, for your time.